Welcome, Northern Arizona. How you doing? Nicholls and McNeese glad to see you, Grambling State. It turns out the Athlon FCS Power Pole isn't just CAA football and the Missouri Valley, that there really is a bunch of other surging teams out there. The Big Sky and Southland now have 4 teams each in the poll, and 8 conferences are checking in with representatives. Yep, it's a whole new world in October. Here is the Athlon FCS Power Poll heading into Week 7 of the regular Season 1. James Madison 50-20 CAA last week's ranking 1. Last week's result. Title of note: the bye week was so relaxing that Coach Mike Houston wore a purple Hawaiian shirt to the fan and press luncheon. Good. Another visit by ESPN's College Game Day be a distraction before the Villanova showdown. Next opponent: number 13 Villanova, October 14th 2. North Dakota State 50-20 Missouri Valley. Last week's ranking 2. Last week's result: 520 win over Indiana State of Notre Dame. Carson Wentz. How about cousin Connor Wentz catching 2 touchdowns in the Bison's second shutout win in 3 weeks? Next opponent at number 5 Youngstown State, October 14th 3. South Dakota 50-20 Missouri Valley. Last week's ranking 4. Last week's result: 3,128 win over Theno 3. Youngstown State of Notre Dame. Shamar Jackson set the USD single-game record with 229 receiving yards, catching 1 touchdown among his 11 receptions. The Coyotes are 50 for the first time since 2005. Next opponent: Indiana State, October 14th 4. Jacksonville State 41-20 Ohio Valley. Last week's ranking 5. Last week's result: 3,414 win over Austin Peay. Of note, the Gamecocks' 26 straight OVC wins tie the conference mark of the 199,092 Eastern Kentucky teams. Conveniently, the Colonels are head coach John Grass' team's next opponent. Next opponent: Eastern Kentucky, October 14th 5. Youngstown State 32-11 Missouri Valley. Last week's ranking 3. Last week's result: 3,128 loss to Theno 4. South Dakota. Of note, the Penguins aren't used to giving up 360 passing yards and 486 total yards. Next opponent: number 2 North Dakota State, October 14th 6. South Dakota State 41-11 Missouri Valley. Last week's ranking 8. Last week's result: 4,914 win over Southern Illinois of Notre Dame. It's just not fair that Dallas Goedert and Jake Weineke can be limited to 56 combined receiving yards, yet running back Brady Mangarelli goes for 220 yards and 2 touchdowns on 20 carries. Next opponent: Northern Iowa, October 14th 7. Eastern Washington 42-30 Big Sky. Last week's ranking 6. Last week's result: 4,138 win over UC Davis. Of note, Gage Gubrud rallied WU with 3 of his 6 touchdown passes in the 4th quarter. Next opponent: Montana State, October 14th 8. Central Arkansas 41-20 Southland. Last week's ranking 7. Last week's result: 277 win over Houston Baptist. Of note, with 4 turnovers, the Bears' defense made the difference in a sluggish effort following their rousing win over Sam Houston State. Next opponent: Stephen F. Austin, October 14th 9. Sam Houston State 41-21 Southland. Last week's ranking 9. Last week's result: 2,716 win over Stephen F. Austin. Of note, the Bearcats have a series record 7 straight wins against rival SFA. Davian Davis hauled in 13 passes for 151 yards and 1 touchdown. Next opponent: Northwestern State, October 14th 10. Wofford 50-30 Southern. Last week's ranking 10. Last week's result: 3,528 OT win over number 19 Western Carolina. Of note, Andre Stoddard rushed for 157 yards and 2 touchdowns, including the overtime winner. The Terriers have won 3 SoCon games by a combined 9 points. Next opponent at the Citadel, October 14th 11. Western Illinois 41-11 Missouri Valley. Last week's ranking 12. Last week's result: 3,829 win over Theno 22 Northern Iowa. Of note, the Leathernecks scored 2 touchdowns in the final 6 seconds to make it 2 straight wins at the Unidome. Next opponent: Missouri State, October 14th 12. Richmond 32-11 CAA. Last week's ranking 13. Last week's result: 4,138 2 OT win over Albany. Of note, Griffin Trout's 34-yard field goal was the game winner in the second overtime. Next opponent at Towson, October 14th 13. Villanova 42-21 CAA. Last week's ranking 14. Last week's result: 310 win over Maine. Of note, Nova gained only 219 yards in its second straight home shutout, but forced 6 turnovers, including Jacon Amos' chapter 99-yard fumble return for a touchdown. Up next, the defending CAA and FCS national champ. Next opponent at number 1 James Madison, October 14th 14. Elon 51-30 CAA last week's ranking 16 last week's result 2,517 win over William Mary. Of note, Malcolm Summers rushed for 2 touchdowns and Elon gained its first 5-game winning streak since 2009. Next opponent at Rhode Island October 21, 15. New Hampshire 41-20 CAA last week's ranking 15 last week's result. Idle of note, the Wildcats have lost the game coming off their bye in each of the past 2 seasons. Next opponent at Stony Brook October 14, 16. North Carolina at 60-30 MEAC last week's ranking 17 last week's result 443 win over Delaware State. Of note, the Aggies, who are the first FCS team to reach 60, have allowed a combined 30 points in 5 non-FBS games. Next opponent at Florida A&M October 21, 17. Weber State 41-20 Big Sky last week's ranking 18 last week's result. Idle of note, although no Wildcat has hit the 20 tackle mark this season, 13 players are in double figures. Next opponent Southern Utah October 14, 18. Illinois State 41-20 Missouri Valley last week's ranking 11 last week's result 3,716 loss to Northern Arizona. Of note, after the Redbirds allowed only 455 yards and 1 touchdown through the air in their first 4 games, Northern Arizona torched them for 403 yards and 4 scores. Next opponent at Southern Illinois October 14, 19. Western Carolina 42-21 Southern last week's ranking 19 last week's result 3,528 overtime loss to number 10 Wofford. Of note, the Catamounts made an excellent account of themselves in the loss to SoCon preseason favorite Wofford. Terrion Robinson became the Catamounts' all-time leader in career receptions, now at 199. Next opponent at 2 October 14, 20. Samford 42-21 Southern last week's ranking 20 last week's result 267 win over VMI. Of note, the Bulldogs will enjoy a bye week before they get their shot at first place Wofford. Next opponent at number 10 Wofford October 21, 21. Northern Arizona 32-20 Big Sky last week's ranking unranked last week's result 3,716 win over Theno 11 Illinois State. Of note, neither defending Big Sky champ, Eastern Washington and North Dakota, is on the schedule, so the surging Lumberjacks figure to be in title contention behind quarterback Case Cookus. Next opponent at Portland State October 14, 22. Montana 42-21 Big Sky last week's ranking 25 last week's result 3,931 win over Idaho State. Of noted, redshirt freshman quarterback Gresh Jensen has been excellent since replacing an injured Reese Phillips. He accounted for 383 yards and 5 touchdowns in the win at rival Idaho State. Next opponent North Dakota October 14, 23. Nicholls 42-31 Southland last week's ranking unranked last week's result 14-10 win over Northwestern State. Of note, after not starting due to an injury, quarterback Chase Forkide came off the bench to lift the Colonels past Northwestern State. Their defense allowed only 202 total yards. Next opponent at Abilene Christian October 14, 24. McNeese 51-31 Southland last week's ranking unranked last week's result 137 win over Abilene Christian. Of note, the Cowboys are a game-ending Nicholls field goal away from being unbeaten. Next opponent Incarnate Word October 21, 25. Grambling State 51-30 SWAC last week's ranking unranked last week's result 3,421 win over Prairie View AM. Of note, the defending SWAC champion Tigers don't appear to be as strong as last season, but they've won 20 straight regular season conference games. Next opponent Elkhorn State October 21 Power Poll Possibility North Carolina Central 41-30 MEAC, written by Craig Haley, who is part of the Athlon Contributor Network. Haley has covered the FCS level since 1999 and is the national writer for www.fcs.football. He appears frequently on radio shows and podcasts to discuss everything FCS. Follow him on Twitter at Craig Haley. Photo courtesy Northern Arizona University Athletics.